It starts with me shifting the cultural climate through the study and practice of Kingian nonviolence. This was the King Center's theme for 2024, a year that began with education, service, inspiration, and celebration in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 95th birthday.
In 2024, the King Center reached over 100,000 youth nationally and 8,000 globally. 46 students, including 20 international students, successfully completed the 2022 to 2024 Beloved Community Leadership Academy cohort. 55 young women embarked on their journey with the Empower program, a Beloved Community Leadership Academy program sponsored by the Goldman Sachs 1 Million Black Women Initiative.
Me coming here today, I've learned how to present myself in a business setting.
We were on mission and shifting culture in 2024. 150 City of Atlanta interns were equipped by our Nonviolence 365 Leadership Development Workshops. 500 Global King Center Institute students enrolled in the Nonviolence 365 online masterclass.
Dr. King's philosophy and his work plays a key role in the current work that I'm doing because fighting child poverty, especially in Africa, is no easy.
We were excited to announce the Emerging Dreamers College Student Roundtable and Program launch in partnership with the WNBA's Atlanta Dream.
I feel like all of us together owe it to Dr. King and to the King Center for putting this program together.
With the sponsorship and partnership of Microsoft, the King Center advanced the digital preservation of its archives, which, along with its library, comprises the largest repository of primary source materials on Dr. King and the American Civil Rights Movement.
This year, we showcased our beloved community culture. We led the way in transforming the landscape with our courageous conversations. 1,004 volunteers dedicated a remarkable 7,565 hours of their time.
I want to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank all the teachers, all the volunteers, all the sponsors, everybody that have something to do with it, and the world would change because of what you're doing.
Now, more than ever, we need Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community worldview, love-centered nonviolent strategy, and global perspective.
You have a responsibility to continue the freedom struggle in the world.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal, because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 online.
That if we are going to make significant change within our own nation or within the world community, because we can't separate them any longer, is that we must start immediately and everywhere to teach and expose people to the philosophy of nonviolence. And it's the philosophy and the practice of nonviolence must be understood on a very, very wide scale. And if we can do that with enough people strategically placed, I think we can begin to solve these problems that seem so monumental in scope now.
Nonviolence is not sterile passivity, but a powerful moral force which makes for social transformation. Sooner or later, all the peoples of the world will have to discover a way to live together in peace and thereby transform this pending cosmic elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. If this is to be achieved, man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Good evening, good evening, good evening, and welcome tonight to the Better Together Virtual Experience presented by the King Center. We are so glad to have you here with us on tonight. I want to greet all of you who are joining in the virtual space, and I thank you so much for being here with us on tonight for this powerful, empowering experience that we're going to have on tonight. So I hope you are seated, you are ready, prepared to engage, to be empowered and be inspired and learn about the transformative power of nonviolence right here in the virtual space. So right now, I want to welcome all of you here on tonight. Also, while we're joining in, I want to share with you now that there's a QR code that we're hoping you will share and plug in with and connect with. Make sure that you share it with your friends, your family. Again, respond with to the questions in the survey as we engage with tonight's discussion and exchange on tonight. Also, with that, I do want to share with you that, again, we are here. I am Damian Madison with Better Together. And Better Together is an initiative of the King Center, a new initiative that is designed to engage faith leaders, organizations, and also members of large trainings, discussions, and activities with the goal of creating a more humane and more a just society, equitable and peaceful culture. And this initiative is designed to realize this goal by providing participants, those who engage with the nonviolent principles of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., rooted in agape love. And this result is Kingian nonviolence. And so tonight, we're going to have a discussion about how nonviolence is a pathway to lasting change. So again, connect with us, plug in tonight. I promise you'll be empowered and inspired to do different, to create different, to live different, to share love in a different way, through the principles of nonviolence espoused by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, on tonight, we have some very, very wonderful guests on tonight, which I'll present in just a moment. But I also want to make you aware of an upcoming event here at the King Center on April 3rd. It is King's last speech, Nonviolent Strategies for Economic Justice, on Thursday, April 3rd. Make sure you connect, plug in with us. I promise you again, you'll be inspired and empowered in a wonderful way. Again, it'll be a discussion with our very own Dr. Bernice King, the CEO of the King Center, and Vonnetta West, our learning experience curator and nonviolence educator. So again, mark your calendar, plug in, connect, and make sure you share with your friends and family. King's last speech, Nonviolent Strategies for Economic Justice. Now on tonight, again, I want to park here and share with you our wonderful panelists for tonight's discussion. I promise you, you do not want to miss this. So if you're watching, wherever you're watching from, I invite you now to, again, share with your friends, share it, like it, comment on it, and let's plug in together for a wonderful time of exchange, conversation, and empowerment on tonight here at the King Center Virtual Experience. Now, also, while we're watching, I want you, wherever you were from, let's comment, share whether you know where you're watching from. Again, also any questions you may have later on in the exchange. Let's make sure that we plug in, we commune together, and have the exchange together again. And I thank you for being here with us on tonight. Jim, I see you. Thank you so much for being here on tonight from Long Island, New York. Thank you so much. Wow, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. They're on YouTube. All right. We are so glad to have you with us on tonight. Well, while we're in this moment, I do want to share with you who our panelists are for tonight's discussion. I want to present to you and share with you Mr. Charles Alphin Sr., who is a nonviolent 365 senior instructor and senior trainer here at the King Center. Mr. Charles Alphin will be with us on tonight. And then also we're going to have Dr. Vonnetta West, who is a learning experience curator and nonviolence educator here at the King Center as well. And then most importantly, I do want to share with you, we have a special guest tonight. We have the CEO of the King Center in the person of Dr. Bernice A. King, and we are elated and expecting to have a great time with her on tonight. She is a global thought leader, a strategist, a solutionist, an orator, a peace advocate, and of course, the CEO of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, the King Center, which was founded by her mother as the official living memorial to the life, work, and legacy of her father. In this position, Bernice King she continues to advance her parents' legacy of nonviolent social change through policy, advocacy, research, as well as education and training through the Kingian philosophy of nonviolence, which she rebranded as Nonviolence 365 or NV 365. Tonight, I want to welcome all of you to our discussion on tonight with Charles Alphin, Vonnetta West, and Dr. Bernice A. King on tonight. Let's give them a round of applause in the virtual space for being here with us on tonight. We are excited to have them here. Wow. Well, good evening, good evening, good evening. Bring to all of you. And thank you so much for being here with us on tonight. So, good evening. To begin our discussion tonight. The goal of this discussion is to really share and impact to our viewers and those who are watching, listening, and even wondering what is nonviolence, and may have some questions about, again, this philosophy. And so tonight, I want to make sure that we kind of share light, wrestle with some of the tensions that we have with nonviolence, but also kind of have a discussion about some of the misunderstandings about nonviolence and how we can navigate and impact it in a better way to bring a proper education and awareness to what it is, and also how it's a pathway to lasting change. So I want to again begin the conversation with an opening question, and this is for Dr. King, wrestling with the historical roots and a personal lens on nonviolence. As the daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And CEO of the King Center, you carry a very unique legacy. And so with that in mind, what is Kingian nonviolence, and what personal lessons have you drawn from practicing nonviolence as a lifestyle?
So let me first thank you, Damien, for the question, and welcome everybody to this virtual experience. I am glad that you started off this discussion asking about what nonviolence is, and especially as a lifestyle, because in most instances, when people think about nonviolence, period, whether it be Kingian nonviolence or other schools of nonviolence, the focus is, in most cases, around nonviolence in a social justice context. And while most of us are familiar with it in that way, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually taught, believed, taught, and lived nonviolence as a way of life. And that's why in 2012, when I became CEO, I thought it was important that we begin to frame nonviolence in the more holistic way that he saw it, as a way of life, that it's not just about what we do in social justice movements and how we are in social justice movements, it's how we are on a day-to-day basis. And so from the King Center perspective, we have defined nonviolence specifically from the Dr. King philosophy and methodology as a love-centered, which is a key phrase, love-centered way of thinking, speaking, acting, and engaging that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. And so I want people to, as we go through this conversation tonight, I want us to make sure that we keep our minds on this love-centered way, and the thinking where it all begins, our mindset. So I look at it as a mindset and a methodology that we are talking about, and leads to, and there's a lot to unpack in that definition. We won't do it right here, right now. But specifically, I want to focus on the personal part of the transformation, because you asked me, what personal lessons have I drawn from practicing nonviolence as a way of life? And again, I want everybody to keep this in mind. I can't overemphasize it. For Dr. King, it is a way of life. For Coretta Scott King, nonviolence is a way of life. For Bernice King, nonviolence is a way of life. The Kingian way is a way of life. And so it starts with me. So wherever you are listening, just touch yourself and say, it starts with me. Because what happens through the experience of studying, which we're going to talk about tonight, nonviolence, and beginning to immerse yourself in it, and then practicing it, or you may say experimenting, as my father suggested in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture, where he said, I suggest that the philosophy and strategy of nonviolence immediately become a subject of study and serious experimentation in every field of human conflict, by no means excluding relations between nations. And so as you study it and then practice it or experiment with it, you will discover some things like I discovered. First of all, it helps to regulate your emotions. Your emotions can get out of control in any relationship, any personal relationship, any relationship with people who you're adverse to, whether it be in the workplace, in the home, and then certainly in society with or in between, countries and nations. And if you don't have the regulation of your emotions, they become the dictator of your actions. So you have to be able to discipline your emotions, and nonviolence helps you to discipline your emotions. For me in particular, I have a lot of history of being angry, just carrying just the spirit of anger, out of a lot of my life experiences and losses. And nonviolence has helped me to channel that anger in a much more constructive way. So nonviolence helps us to channel those emotions more constructively. More importantly, from a personal perspective, I have learned that it's not important that I be right. What's important is that I create an atmosphere where I can develop a deeper understanding. And this is hard, particularly when people are hurting and harming you. You're not dismissing their acts. I need to emphasize that, because oftentimes people think when we talk about nonviolence from a love-centered way, we're kind of like overlooking the injustice, the wrongdoing, the evil, the meanness. No, you're not overlooking it. You are just approaching it in a manner that you don't become like what you are trying to address. And so it helps you to develop a greater understanding and even empathy, which may be hard for most people to understand with an adversary. How can I empathize? For me, I've come to understand things greater than the moment, that what is happening in this moment, there's a narrative behind this. There's a story behind this, how we got here, how people became the way that they are to get to this point. And nonviolence has helped me to elevate myself to a greater understanding in that way. So I let go of my right to be right so that I can open the avenue to begin to do information gathering. You hear more about that on even the adversary, the opponent, to understand, because if you're going to create a path forward where injustice ceases and love prevails, where you overcome injustice or inequities, you have to have a holistic understanding of what's going on, including where does this come from, to adequately address it. So that's another thing, and not to belabor, because I know everybody else has to talk tonight. But nonviolence just, holistically, it helps your thinking, it helps your speaking, and it helps, which is your language, and it helps your actions, So I have learned through time how to better phrase things, not to water down things, so that's even part of de-escalating, because when something happens that is hurtful, harmful, insulting, anything, the knee-jerk reaction is to just fire off at the mouth. But nonviolence, again, is that discipline that helps me to regulate, to take a deep breath, to think about what I'm about to say in a manner that respects the dignity and worth even of my adversary. And so there's so much to nonviolence that we can talk about. But thank you for focusing on the part that we seldom talk about, which is the way of life. We usually talk about nonviolent resistance and nonviolent campaigns, direct action all of that is important. But if your heart's not right, if your mind's not right, then what you're doing in terms of your actions won't be as effective. And so nonviolence gives us the right attitude, the right mindset, and the right spirit for taking on conflict, injustice, and inequity, and creating a pathway to ultimately create a beloved community. Because at the end of the day, especially in the United States of America, and maybe even other countries, we have to live side by side after the stuff that happens. In Montgomery, when they went back to those buses, my father said to them, look, when we go back to these buses, recognize this was a victory for justice. This wasn't a victory over white people against Black people. That these white people now have to adjust to a new way. And so we want to carry ourselves a certain way. We want to posture ourselves a certain way. And so I'm going to just stop there.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I love how you even mentioned that nonviolence is not the dismissal of the action, but it's a different way of approaching the action, or the transgression, as it were. And so all too often I hear comments where people say, well, why be nonviolent, or why don't we do anything? We're not saying we don't do anything, it's how we do it, which again ties to your lifestyle comment, why it's important and why we be adjusted and live differently. Dr. West, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the same question.
What is nonviolence? I think, in addition to what Dr. King shared, and hello to everyone, good evening, good morning, hello, greetings, for those of you joining us from different places around the world. And I would just add that it's important to remember that I would frame it as a posture for living and acting no matter what the situation. Nonviolence gives me a way to behave and a way to think no matter what other people are doing. And that's critical to understand, because a lot of times we could allow other people to dictate our behavior. We could allow who's been elected president to dictate how we treat other people with dignity. We could allow how people voted to determine whether or not we try to defeat them or defeat the policies and the systems that may be harming other people. And so we have a choice. Nonviolence is a choice. And it is either that or non-existence. And Dr. King also says our choice is nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. And I think when we consider being on the trajectory to co-annihilation, we have to choose nonviolence as not just something that helps me fix a social ill, but it helps me fix myself on the inside. And it's that fixing of self that's often a struggle. And when I think about what nonviolence can do, I get excited about that, because I know we haven't begun to work on the heart change that's needed to sustain policy change. And I think when the day comes when we work on the heart change with as much veracity and as much passion as we work on policy change, and we don't even work on that to the level that we should, then we'll see some great change in our society across the globe. Because what has to change, and the reason why nonviolence is so important, is because we had policy change, the act us in enacting as a society in the United States, those are being dismantled. And that's because there was no heart change. And so if those Klan members who are lynching people and the other folks who are lynching people and laughing, you see their children in those photos as well. If there was never heart change in those families, then those policies will be dismantled. Because we have to have heart change, even if we didn't enact those. If we didn't lynch people, we have to decide we're going to reach across and have some critical conversations. So I think I would define nonviolence for me as critically important. And as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, it's the answer to crucial political and moral questions of our time.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Mr. Alphin, any comments?
Wow, there's so much that has been said. First of all, it's my honor to be here and share in the dialogue. And certainly Damien and the King Center for setting this up. I misunderstood nonviolence, and to be transparent, I didn't believe in Dr. King, and I didn't understand nonviolence. So I've been transformed by the King Center, Mrs. King and other people. So I looked at it as passive and do nothing and turn the other cheek. And I found out I was so wrong, because it's love in action. And so, in fact, Gandhi and Dr. King said, if you do nothing, that's not what he was talking about. There's volumes of nonviolence. But in a crisis, if you do nothing, a conflict, then you become part of the problem. They call silence and just getting along. And so you have to do something. And it's very, Dr. King called it militant. Nonviolence can be militant. In fact, it's demanding, persistent, and consistent. He said it in 57. So therefore, I had to learn what it was. And Gandhi and Dr. King used it as a weapon that cannot be defeated if you understand it. So therefore, it's a lot of education and learning you have to do that begins to transform your thinking, because so a person thinks, so they act. And in nonviolence, I found out through my 40 years of practicing is that you have to ask yourself, what is your goal in a conflict with your loved ones or in the community? What is your goal? And I would learn Dr. King and Mrs. King that our goal is a beloved community. So if your action doesn't fit into not winning over the person, but to winning the person over, you're probably committing an act of violence on people you say you love in the family, and also people you disagree with in the community. So it's a very, Dr. King classified as very morally excellent and practically sound. My law enforcement experience just tells me that nonviolence is how you save lives. And certainly people get killed in it, but more people get killed with violence than they do with nonviolence. So it's practically, and it takes people, groups of people, to make sure that you're safe. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's something I've studied, and I'm studying now to love and like, and the deepness of love, and I thought love was just one definition. So it's a lot to learn, and I'm sure I'll learn from this dialogue, and I'm looking forward, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much for that.
Damien.
Yes.
I just want to mention, as we were talking, when I listened to all, I don't know how, I guess you can listen to yourself. But you know, we're talking holistically here about mindfulness. You know, it really is engaging the mind in a whole different way than we've been accustomed to and we've been trained in this world. So it really re-engages your mind at a higher level of operating that influences eventually how you speak and how you act and how you engage, you know, because when Charles was just talking about the goal, well, you have to be mindful of that in the midst of conflict, because emotion gets, you know, in the way, and you have to stop and say, okay, what is the goal, or what is the outcome that needs to be achieved here? And especially, you know, when you move it outside into the social justice vein, that oftentimes can get lost. And then, you know, people start doing any and everything because there's nothing to galvanize them around that, you know, that goal. So.
No, that's great. You know, and that mindfulness kind of leads to the next question, Dr. West. Really, you know, that provides a foundation for understanding that nonviolence is a philosophy that comes with a strategy, and their principles and steps. You know, they kind of embody that strategy and how we function, how we live, how we move. So, as a senior trainer, Dr. West, and as a scholar of nonviolence, will you kind of share with us, you know, the principles and steps of nonviolence and how they all work together, and how do these ideas challenge how we navigate?
Did she hear you?
I'm not sure.
Thank you for that question. I'm here.
I'm delayed.
Look, my internet's acting a little funny, but it's okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. I think we're going to share more about the principles and steps a bit later, but I would just say at this point, given everything we've shared about nonviolence, it's important to understand that we've spent a significant amount of time as humanity, from our media to our entertainment, to our conversation, to our relationships, holistically and collectively trashing our minds. And we've done some things that have been tangibly horrible to our thinking. So much so that I believe Dr. King understood that in order to engage steps, we needed first to have a revolution of values. And I think the principles provide us with that, the 6 principles of nonviolence, because they give us core values, a way of thinking. Before I even get to action, I have to have this way of thinking. And they give us a way to have power that's not abusive. They center us in love. They give us love-centered thinking, so that when I have power, and whatever I think power is, Dr. King simply said power is the ability to achieve purpose. And then power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. But when I have power, I can have power in a loving way, and I won't be harmful to people. Without these principles, we often have folks executing what they call Kingian direct action, void of love and void of a principle approach, which becomes dangerous. When you take direct action without love, Dr. King said power without love is reckless and abusive. And so we have a lot of unprincipled attempts to use direct action. And so I think it's important to remember that these steps that we'll talk about later have to be undergirded by these 6 principles. We have 6 steps that have to be undergirded by the 6 principles, and they help us in every area of life, all of the principles, all of the steps, so that when we meet moments that are challenging to our character and to our consciousness, we're able to choose a path that may be challenging going forward, but it shows us how not to hurt other people in getting to the things that we believe are best for ourselves or for society.
You know, if you don't mind, I'm going to add a follow to that question. I'd like to answer. And that is also, you know, so how do these ideas challenge us in the way that we usually understand power, resistance, and even conflict? You know, how should that challenge us?
It's a misunderstanding of power. When we think about, I even have a problem with the phrase "let's speak truth to power," because as I understand power, especially from a Kenyan perspective, you don't have to have a lofty title to have power. You don't have to have a great position to have power. People have power. We have the ability to achieve purpose. And with that Kenyan definition, I think we can get some understanding that because we misunderstood power, we often abuse each other. And nonviolence gives us a way to use power that's healthy. It gives us a way to resist. It's often misunderstood. That's why Dr. King said it's not sterile passivity, because he probably been hearing that nonviolence is passive, but it's not. And so a lot of people are saying things about nonviolence. They never studied it. They never really taken a dive into Dr. King's teachings. And so that's why we at the King Center encourage folks to read Dr. King in context. That when you get a quote where he's saying something that you believe is passive, go get the full context. Or if he's saying something that you believe is overly aggressive, like a riot is the language of the unheard, go get the context. Read and listen to all of the other America. But if we don't do that, we have a very distorted view of what nonviolence is, from talking about power to resistance to other components of nonviolence.
Thank you for that. Mr. Alphin, any comments you want to share about that?
Yeah, I think that one definition, as Dr. West said, nonviolence is the right use of power. And I've learned through my experiences and mine, which we'll talk about later, that we have to really check ourselves on how we get involved in the ego and the macho and the power struggle. It can be in the home, it can be on the workforce, it can be with a gender, et cetera, a spouse or a partner. And we have to challenge ourselves about how we get into that position, and then recognize what it is and how it can be abusive to people, especially people you say you love, your children, your wife, or workforce, and the church, even the church. So that has to be a soul searching. You have to look in the mirror and begin to look at self first, and what percentage do you contribute in the conflict? Dr. King was always asking himself, what percentage do I contribute? And that's a self-searching question, and very difficult to some people because they want to solve other people's problem. And if you could just be more nonviolent, but they don't recognize the percentage that they carry. And I think people who are secure, they're leaders that are secure, they're willing to give up the power for change and not be in the front of the parade. Dr. King wrote several articles, and one of them was The Drum Major Instinct, where we want to be first. And I want to be the first person that leads a television scene, or I want to be on television. So all that has to be examined. And I would suggest that you examine yourself first and see how you participate in these types of things that you're not really conscious of, but sometimes you are conscious.
Thank you so much. Dr. King, any comments?
No, I think they've sufficiently covered it.
All right. So Mr. Alphin, so I'll come back to you. And you've admittedly shared that you've had a long journey with nonviolence. And in fact, you said that it's transformed you. So can you share with us a moment that really affirmed for you that nonviolence actually works, not just in theory, but on the ground in real life situations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I really appreciate it because I get affirmed every day. And I've been doing this since I met Mrs. King in 1981, and I went to the training at the King Center and met people like Honorable Andrew Young, Honorable John Lewis, and C.T. Vivian, and Bevel, Dorothy Cotton, Diane Nash, and she exposed me because she had a weekly training session that she brought people in. And I had 1,000 questions because I was sure nonviolence didn't work. And so my transformation began listening to people on a freedom ride that we happened in 1981, that they've changed this nation and didn't fight anybody, didn't cuss out anybody, didn't use any weapons. And they brought this nation to their knees, to its knees. And that's what I wanted to find out, because I had been fighting since I was segregated in St. Louis. And I didn't feel good after I would violate somebody physically. And I was angry. I was an angry Black man in the United States of what they did to me when I was young and my father. So I didn't repeat the I pledge allegiance. When they were saying with liberty and justice for all, I would just move my lips, because I know this country was not for liberty and justice for all, the way they treated me in the police department and the service and in my community. So I was angry and I was mad, and I took it out on people that didn't look like me, and I began to get a dislike for white people. So in 81, I was 41 years old, and I met Mrs. King and went to the King Center. And since then, I've gone all over the world. First went to Russia in 1992, where they called to see what we could do with the transition of the Soviet Union into Russia. And I did lecture at Moscow University, this philosophy, Kenyan philosophy of Nonviolent 365, the KGB, and begin to understand, how do you run a democracy? What works in a democracy? And how is it other people and by other people? What does the police department and law enforcement do in a democracy? And then from there, I went into Haiti when Aristide and Cedars were fighting. Mrs. King sent us down there to see if we could reconcile that position. Cedars was ready to reconcile, but Aristide was not ready, and we did not get them together. And then went into studied in India with Dr. Radha Krishnan about Dr. King's philosophy, and then into South America, Nigeria, training the guerrillas in Nigeria, and also in South Africa, a project that Bernice King came over, and Mrs. King, Mrs. Scott King, and witnessed the inauguration of Mandela. We've been in South Africa for 4 months. We went in there to train people how to respond to violence, because every other African country that had gotten this independence of the bloodshed. And Mrs. King was contacted by the State Department and negotiated a curriculum of training for South Africans. And we trained about 85 leaders, and they trained over 300,000. So our whole approach is training of trainers. And I'll end up with my special moment, I guess, would be in Colombia, South America. I went to Colombia, South America from 1999, a conference at the King Center with Mrs. Corrigan, a Nobel laureate from Northern Ireland. And Mrs. King spoke also there. And out of that conference, they asked us to come to Colombia, South America. I didn't know where Colombia was specifically, nor did I know it was the murder capital of the world. You know, that's where the drug cartel, et cetera, was in. And we went to 1999, went to Colombia. And the confirming that this works, not only the things that I've told you with nationally and internationally, but in Colombia, the FARC was very abusive, and drug sellers and cartels and kidnapping. And we began to train in Colombia. We started with leaders, church leaders, the University of Antioquia, and then we went into Bella Vista, one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. And we went in there with certain people who had killed each other, all the guerrillas, the FARC and the ELN, and they were crowded into Bella Vista. It was built for 1,700 people, and they had 5,100 people in that prison. And they had over 200 killings a year in that prison. And we went in there with nonviolence, and they accepted it. Long story short, they accepted it. They organized a classroom where they began to teach. They wrote a letter to the governor asking the young men in the barrels not to join gangs. When they bombed a church in Cali and killed some African-American children and females, they gave up their whole weekend of food and shipped it down to those people. I've been to Colombia, South America 26 times. And the last time we went in, Casado, this is my moment of recognizing how people can change. Casado is a city in the hills that harvests coffee beans. And they were shipping their coffee beans, their whole harvest, down to sell. And the FARC stopped them in their trucks and pulled AK-47s on them. And the priest started praying. and they hit the priest in the head with the back of his gun and took his rosary and threw it in the water, in the ocean, in the river, and then took all their harvest. So they didn't have any harvest, any money for the harvest. And we heard about it in Medellin, and Governor Gaviria said we need to go and see how we can help them, because they wanted to, how would you deal with that non-violently? Short story, long story short, we went to Casado. FARC stopped us. Dr. Lafayette was kidnapped, the governor. They did kill the governor a year later in hostage, and as he was being held by the FARC. But Casado has grown, and I was there in May. They've now declared themselves as a nonviolent city. Every street is named after a peacemaker. And Dr. King, Dr. Bernice King, your father's name is on the street. And they've dedicated that as a nonviolent city. I did training in Casado, been there at least 5 times. And what they've done is they decided they want a peaceful setting, and they declared that. And last time I was there in May, the FARC leader, now the FARC leader, they've come out of the jungle, and the FARC leader was talking to Dr. Governor Gaviglio's son. He was 14 years old when his father was killed. He's 32 now. And we were sitting there on the stage talking, and they were talking to each other. And all of a sudden, his name is Daniel. He got up and walked across the stage and said, I want to let you know that I forgive you for all of giving the order to killing my daddy. And they stood on that stage and hugged each other and reconciled there and said, we need to work together to make this country a better country. Daniel is now one of the trainers, and Luis Patero is the one that started this 20-some years ago, yes. And he was Dr. Page says his title covered nonviolent advisor to the government. And Dr. Page out of Hawaii said he's never seen any other country that has a nonviolent advisor except in Antioquia, Colombia. And that type of confirmation, not only with Colombia, but with gang leaders. Dr. King and I went out to California with a barbaric meeting with Rodney King, and saw those XXX gang members convert. I've been policing. I've seen police convert young people. She trained with us. So we brought young people down there from St. Louis that were released from juvenile detention. We've seen teachers train how a teacher can have a nonviolent classroom. So look, it's so. I guess every day I see my reason why I'm where I am. I will never go back to violence. There's no way anybody could ever take me back to violence. As much as I've learned from the King Center, and as much as I experienced this in my family, my children, I'm just sold out on the philosophy of Kenyan nonviolence and Nonviolence 365.
Wow.
And Damien, he often says, he didn't say it in this conversation, but he often says that Kenyan nonviolence helped to save his marriage. I just wanted to insert that.
If I hadn't have been with this, Dr. King, I forgot. I've been married 63 years, and this philosophy saved my marriage. If it hadn't been for this philosophy, I would be divorced.
Wow, that's phenomenal. You know, just the fact that a philosophy, and Dr. King, you mentioned earlier that it works outside the bounds of social justice and just movements, but just a real lifestyle at home. And so with that in mind, Dr. King, I do want to kind of just talk to you for a second, because of course, as a CEO of the King Center, as the daughter, Dr. King and Credit Scott King, what was the moment for you where non-violence became real as a lifestyle for yourself?
Well, without going into details, because I don't think this is the proper forum for doing that, it really became most real for me when my brothers and I had a conflict that everybody knows publicly. We had conflict. And it became real for me then because at that particular point, I was the CEO of the King Center. And I recognized that either I'm going to believe in and try to practice what my parents, my father formulated from a lot of different philosophers and theologians, and predominantly Jesus Christ being the center and the foundation, or I don't need to be in this position. So I started on my journey to really taking serious the principles, number one, of nonviolence, which are not easy to embrace. As we will be exposed to them later, you will understand how important they are, but how difficult that they can be to embrace, and even the steps of nonviolence. So that's really when it really the light bulb for me went off. Like, hey, this is an opportunity for us to show that conflict is real, regardless, even when you grow up in the family of the proponent of nonviolence. But how you deal with that conflict. And sometimes you may not get to the ultimate resolution. You're still processing, you're still working, but something happens inside of you. And that's what I just can't overemphasize the power of what happens to you with nonviolence. And when you become that vessel, it can become very strong and very powerful, and it can become infectious. I think that's why it was effective in the movement, because it was so much in my father that he was able to influence and inspire so many other people to at least take the initial steps of embracing it as a tactic. And then others who went on to really, deal with it in a lifestyle way.
Thank you so much for sharing that transparently. So right now, I want to pause for a second. Brian Murray says it helped his marriage too.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Brian.
So while we're here, I do want to pause again. And again, Mary Baldwin says the power of love is powerful.
It is.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. While we're here, I also want to pause again and welcome our viewers tonight for joining in with us from wherever you are. Thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful discussion. I also want to remind you that we do have a survey, a QR code we would love for you again to connect with, plug in with, and give us your responses, your feedback on this event on tonight. So scanning QR code and the survey, and thank you so much for making time to do so. Thank you so much. Now, as we move on, I want to kind of shift a bit in our conversation. And Dr. West, this is for you. Nonviolence isn't without critics. And so what are some of the hardest questions or challenges that you hear about it? And how do you help people wrestle with those doubts?
I think one of the criticisms that we hear most often is that nonviolence is weak, that it won't work today, and it's a thing of the past. And one of the main things I do when people share those criticisms is I ask them to try it. As with anything, if you've never experienced it for yourself, it's hard to realize its power. And so I invite people to study, and I may even say, just take today, saying I'm going to choose love instead of hate, and practice that and see what happens to you internally, because nonviolence is an inside-out work. See what happens to you internally and what happens externally in your engagement with people, policies, and practices when you just apply and think about that one principle. And then go to the steps and undergird those steps with that principle of choosing love instead of hate, and see how it improves the quality and condition of your soul, of your language, of your rhetoric, of your thinking, of your social media time, of your family. How do you talk to your family differently? How do you work on policies differently if you just try it? And I think for me, it's important to avoid getting frustrated, because often people don't know what nonviolence is. And that's been intentional in the media, in entertainment even, to try to make it look weak. That's why they show us the end of I Have a Dream instead of I Have a Dream Fully by Dr. King. Because if we can make it look like this was just this man with this dream for people sitting at a table together, versus it being a man who understood how to apply nonviolence to get to the place where we could do that. In other words, he wasn't just saying, let's just be colorblind. He was saying, no. Let's love each other. Let's eradicate the things that prevent us from having justice, from having equity, from having what he called true peace. Let's get rid of those things. So if you make Dr. King this great symbol of nonviolence, this kind of pie in the sky, irrelevant being who just wanted us to love each other and join hands and be together, instead of saying he was a visionary, a transformed nonconformist, a practitioner of nonviolence who believed that it could deconstruct not only our heart ills, it could deconstruct the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty. And I think that's a huge barrier for people because they misunderstand King. They misunderstand nonviolence. But that, again, I believe is intentional. So we have to weed through some of that as well. And I think those practical approaches of talking to people and saying, let's talk about what your thoughts are about nonviolence. Let's talk about where it comes from. Let's talk about how it was developed. And then let's try it. Because you don't know if it works until you try it. They see these campaigns of the past, but we have to ask them to come try it with us today. So I'll go to protests with people, to visuals with people, and say, let's try it. Let's see how it works. And I think that practical approach is what's going to get some people to shift. Some people are going to be critical of it and continue to critique it and not see it as working because they just want to be violent. There are many people in the world who think fists will solve everything and guns are a solution. And they have an opportunity for consciousness. And so I think we just have to keep presenting it and presenting it and presenting it and putting out series like this, Damien, or experiences like this where people can hear about it and learn about it. And it's tangibility because it's not tangible to many people. They see it as weak and passive versus saying there's strength in nonviolence. Perhaps we've been conditioned to think there's strength in violence versus there being strength in seeking to defeat something without dehumanizing other people.
Mr. Alphin, as one who previously doubted, how do you help others wrestle with their doubts?
You're on mute, Charles. Yes. Unmute yourself. You're still on mute. You're still on. There you are.
I think you have to make it practical. When I first heard about it, my first thing was, okay, how do I defend myself? Will I get hurt? I thought it was Black people. I thought this was all for Black people, that they did all this. So those are kind of barriers that I had to get over. And I did it by personal experiences, like asking people once they learn the philosophy, basic philosophy, can you find somebody that you disagree with in your family or in your community and go and reconcile that, make amends, and you take the responsibility. And then come back and debrief what they said and what happened. I think when people learn that they have the power in the conversation and the response, they can begin to learn nonviolence, and it becomes practical because they have conflicts within each other in their family. So I think something, tiny steps. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And you don't make sure you don't want to bite off this big elephant and get choked on it. So I would say begin to get confidence with yourself that this can work, and that it's not a training where you do something 1, 2, 3. It's creative. And you do things to diffuse and to de-escalate the conflict, and you just can't put that in writing because it's creative. It's not static. So I think nonviolence is talking. Nonviolence is having compassion. Nonviolence is loving people who are not lovable, loving the unlovable, not looking for a response in the love, but that it's spontaneous. And all this has to be proven by you that you can do that, because we're orientated with violence, and violence, in my opinion, is against our character. So what we're doing is opening you up and taking you back to who you are as a human being, because the sloppy way of living has produced you some corrupt things that you do that's out of character. And so you have to start small and then be open and not try to force feed, because sometimes we want to force feed and tell people. We present the philosophy to them and said, work for Dr. King and you enjoying these benefits and freedom because the people suffered and died, and you didn't do anything but walk through the door. And all we want you to do is can you work now and take it to the legacy of Dr. King, and let them make the decision, because the answer has to come from them, not us.
Thank you.
And Damon, if I can just add in a more, I guess, simplistic way, nothing works that you don't work. There's a persistence. There's a daily practicing of nonviolence. And I think when people feel that it doesn't work, it's because they're looking for some immediate outcome. And they're also looking externally and defining nonviolence as what happens to the other person. And so I think all of those things have to be taken into consideration when you say, does it work? Is it working on you? And it's just like when you apply yourself to a certain lifestyle and you want to maintain a certain weight, it doesn't work when you don't work it. I mean, you end up going back to those other ways of eating. And so this is like changing your diet, your appetite, when it starts in your mindset and you begin to understand what you have at hand and what you can do to create this kind of life. It requires a discipline, and it's not something you can just put on and then just take it off. It's a lifestyle. And so as any lifestyle, you have to keep it going. And part of that is you have to keep studying too. You have to keep meditating. You got to keep reflecting. You got to test different levers of all of this. And you got to do some reflection, about, how you engage, what you did, where you may have yourself fallen short or what have you. So I just want to add that little bit to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that's a great segue into our next question, Dr. King. So given that, in a world where we're hearing, and Jack said that's some timely advice, Dr. King. So in a world where we're hearing attacks, we're seeing attacks on various words in our space. And one of the words that we're seeing attacks on is the word empathy. And Dr. King, your leadership emphasizes faith and empathy. How have these values helped you stay committed to nonviolence, even when things feel really hard? And how can you give people hope to know that nonviolence still works in the midst of all this?
Well, I mean, for me, if I might be personal with this, my personal faith journey and my relationship with Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit really helps me in navigating. Not that you have to have the same thing that I have, but I'm just speaking from my personal experience. What I've discovered is that, again, on a daily basis, the commitment, the daily commitment, the reflection, and the realization of some things that, whether we agree with it or not, are realities, such as, one of the principles is that the universe is on the side of justice, from a spiritual standpoint, and specifically in the faith tradition that I practice, God is on the side of justice. And when you factor in that equation, the God factor, so to speak, it gives me room to continue to cultivate and develop my my understanding, my sensitivity to others, my open-mindedness to others, and what is needed to continue to cultivate a better world, to fight against these injustices without trying to destroy and defeat people. So by recognizing that we have a personal God, my father studied personalism, and God is not just this abstract being, standing off, in this kind of pious, detached manner, but he is with us. He is present in this process, which is difficult for most people to understand, because if God is present, if he's working in us and he's working through us. And that's with everybody collectively. And so we don't know what's going on in that realm while we are, grounding ourselves in this whole practice and discipline of nonviolence. But we believe we constantly believe that things are working together for a greater purpose. If they didn't believe that things were working together for a greater purpose, we wouldn't have what we have today. Some of the benefits we have, in spite of what people are challenging today, we wouldn't have if the people didn't have that constant belief that they were not alone in this quest. So what keeps me going is I know God is with me, and He's also with me in terms of helping me to stay in a posture of love and understanding and strength, but also that there are others. Sometimes when we're in this space, we forget that other people are here with us. You know, they had each other in that movement, you know. So never see yourself as isolated. That's why it's important to connect in coalitions. That's why it's important to have something like this philosophy of nonviolence. That's what galvanized those people together, because they were there working it together. And that gives you strength. That gives you hope in the midst of all of the difficulty. And at the end of the day, as we said earlier, when you remember and keep at the forefront of your mind the goal, you know, the outcome, when you think about the beloved community. And finally, when you recognize just something that's real as well. Previous generations faced difficult, dark, challenging, evil, and wicked things. We're not the first. More than likely, we may not be the last. And we are of them. They are of us. We come from them. So we have the capacity to draw strength from our ancestors and recognize if they did and their DNA is in me, I can too. And those ancestors, especially now that came through that movement, I think there's a reason to this day that there's still people that are with us who were a part of that nonviolent movement, because they're here to teach us, to show us, and they to keep that continuity going. Because think about this, had that been a violent movement, more than likely, when I say violent, I mean if people had decided to use violence against the violence and the injustice that was inflicted upon them, there would have been a lot of dead folks, a whole lot of dead, and nobody left to tell the story and to show the power and the strength of nonviolence and its transformative effect. So that's what keeps me moving forward in this way. Charles, you're on mute. I think you're trying to say something. Okay.
Yeah, to expand a little bit. They keep muting me. Am I? Okay. 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 I'm not sure, Dr. King. Don't laugh now. I'm not sure why they're doing that. But anyway, what Dr. King is saying is that we have to realize, like a friend of mine out of New York told me, that we're only participating with about 10, 15% of the world that's violence. Most of the world wants to live and let live. And it's our leaders who have gotten us into this understanding of power and struggle and violence. And as I travel the world, I begin to notice that the people want to live and let live. But we're all part of one another, you know, and what affects me directly affects you indirectly. So we have to make sure we don't get tied up in the noise and get the information at who's doing what and for what reason. Normally it's about the dollar, follow the money, or follow the power. So we as people have to make sure our issues, that Dr. King did, was a people issue. And Dr. King and other people that worked with him were responsible for the greatest legislation passed in the 20th century was the desegregation of buses, the Civil Rights Act of 1965 in Birmingham, and the voting rights of 1964 and the voting rights of 1965. Those legislation were passed not with the bullet, not with the ballot, but with the bullet, but with the ballot and with the philosophy and the characteristic of change that was produced and laid out and have a blueprint by Dr. King and Mrs. King. So we can look at history and show what if we would have gotten weapons and tried to overtake or pass a bill with weapons. We had the most superior army in the world. they can walk from Florida to Egypt and wipe out everything they have. So we can't win with, it's illogical to try to win with violence, because we're superior, we're outforced, outpowered with our army, etc. But they didn't know how to defeat Dr. King and Mrs. King and other people, because they were using soul force and not the physical force. So
right.
we told the people, said, look, you don't stop fighting, you just change your weapon. And they understood it, the guerrillas in Nigeria and also South Africa, that you always fight for what is right, but you just change your weapon so that you don't destroy God's property.
That's right.
Wow. Mr. Alphin, you actually went right into our next question, by answering how it shows up in a global space. And so, but again, I would love for you again to kind of recapture that a bit for us. And just do you mind sharing with us about how the King Center has shown up around the world providing nonviolent training?
Wow. In 1992, I did not have a passport. And when I began to work with the King Center, the man, I was telling Mrs. King in a conference, Mrs. Curtis Scott King, that the King Center is the Mecca. We had a conference there, and we had about 9 people on the panel, and everybody on that panel had come through the King Center, had gone all over the world to produce organizations. There's a organization in Johannesburg, South Africa. It's called the King Latuli, and we have to clarify, because Latuli was not a king. It's Dr. King and Chief Latuli. Chief Latuli was the chief of the ANC, African National Congress, and there's a foundation there run by Reverend Dr. Joseph Shiwani. There's a institute in Havana, Cuba, King Center, and Ebenezer Church next to it. There is an institution in Nigeria, and the person that started it now has an airplane called the Air Peace. And we went in Nigeria and dealt with the guerrillas. So when I was in South Africa, we're in the hills of South Africa, where they had never seen an African American. And this young brother introduced me and explained all the details, Dr. King, of your father. And I asked him, I said, where did you learn that from? And he said, well, we were able to get some books and read about Dr. King. So he's noted all over the world. And Dr. King has some stats on who called the Nobel Peace Prize to find out what personality they want to look at. And I think Dr. King led that number, even in the Nobel Peace Prize. So nonviolence doesn't have any borders to it. It's universal, and we can apply it as we travel the world. We're going to take what we do is look for a nonviolent person in that country or in that area, so we don't have to look to the United States for their information. They have people there in their country that advocate the same philosophy as Dr. King. Like in South Africa, we used in one of my modules Ubuntu. Ubuntu means a respect for life. And all the Africans knew that, and they felt that was something their country and their culture already understood. So it's all around the world, even in India, when my friend Dr. Radha Krishnan, and he was talking about how Dr. King, we was talking about the principles and the steps, and he wanted to have the principles of Dr. King because he's with the Council of Indian Affairs there in Kamala, Dr. Radha Krishnan. So I don't think I've been anywhere where it's been turned down or saying we can't do that, because Dr. King wrote for a human being. If you're a human being, he wrote to the heart, not to the color of the skin that you are, or what language you speak, or where you live. If you're a human being, this is how we as human beings, the respect for humanity, the personalism that elevates in that beloved community where we can feed, clothe, and educate everybody in the world. We have the means, but not the will.
Thank you for that so much. Thank you. So, Dr. King, you mentioned earlier about how we partner, build relationships, and so this idea of building bridges across movements. Today's struggles for justice are deeply interconnected. How can nonviolence serve as a unifying force across movements for racial justice, for gender equity, for environmental protection, and more? How can we work together?
Well, something's interesting. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with a young lady who was a part of the movement. I call her young intentionally. She's in her 80s now. And she said, you know, the thing that kept us together was the philosophy. You know, you have to have a philosophy. People need to be rallied around the philosophy. They need to be, in other words, singing off the same sheet of paper. They need something that grounds them and keeps them connected. And that's what nonviolence does. I mean, you know, we know, as Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so when you look at the fact that the root of injustice probably is the same when you get deep down in it. It expresses itself in different manners, but there's a common root there. So if we come together and use this philosophy to help us to stay focused on defeating the injustice and not the people, then we have greater success. We know that nonviolence pulls people together in a way that it can build broader coalitions, because the studies have shown that nonviolence as a means to address injustice is much more effective than any kind of violence that anyone may seek to use to address injustice. You know, it's been much more successful. The outcomes are much more lasting in nonviolence. And so I think nonviolence becomes a rallying point. And if you can get people to commit to it as a whole, then they can solidify their coalitions. I mean, it has that ability. Of course, as we said earlier, you know, the key to all of this is commit. You have to commit. Nothing we're talking about tonight works if there's not first, quote, I think like West said, choose. I mean, you have to choose and commit to nonviolence overall in any kind of conversation about it, whatever we're talking about. It's that commitment at the bottom line that makes all of this work, that helps to, you know, unify and pull together these movements and keeps people focused on the issue. Because oftentimes we can get caught up in our own space and the emotions that come with that particular space related to whatever injustice, inequity, or oppression. But nonviolence can pull us all together to help us see the common links and give us that fuel and that focus, that strategy that can help us to combat it in a way that leads to, you know, more lasting outcomes. I'll just say it that way. But again, that commitment is key, because sometimes we get to a certain place and then we just kind of peter out or we quit or whatever. This has to be an ongoing thing forever and ever and ever to the next generation, preparing a new generation, all that.
Right.
And Dr. King, it's not too difficult. Like your father and your mother, the United Nations and the King Center was once a part of the United Nations, the peacekeeping. That's where nonviolence belongs, the Institute of Peace. Those institutions can reach each other and reach the world, global world fast. And once you get people in their leadership that understands the approach, the philosophy, the mobilization, the organization, the principle of nonviolence, that's where it starts. So I'm optimistic that we have the institutions. We just need the training and education of what this is about and how powerful it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Again, a pathway to lasting change.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Dr. West?
You know, I think overall what I would share about nonviolence, as we've discussed numerous things about it, is that it's become such a point of contention on one end, and then for other people on the other end, it's this kind of banner that we hold up to say that we have the way. I think we're dealing with a generation who is looking for people who are authentic in their leadership. You know, what I believe worked so well with Dr. King is that he was going to jail with the people. So he was telling them before the people, you know, he was going into stuff knowing he was about to be arrested. So it created a sense of camaraderie. And what we're facing today is selecting those moments and looking at the things that are happening globally. I mean, as we're sharing, I'm sitting here thinking about children in the rubble in Gaza and what's happening with mining in the Congo and things that are happening in Sudan and the Institute for Peace. Mr. Alphin just mentioned that. And there's a attempt now to run that board off and get rid of that organization, the Institute for Peace in the United States of America. And so we're facing this layered work that's going to take all hands on deck to get it done. And we have to realize our interconnectedness because no organization can do this work alone, but we're all going to have to find a way, and I believe nonviolence is that way, to be engaged so that we don't usher in our extinction. And that's the very real truth about where we are. I'm hopeful, but I don't think hope means being naive. I think it means saying this is where we are. How do we get out of it? Because it took us a number of years, hundreds, to get into this mess, thousands. So we have to find our way out. And certainly can't assume that we're going to get out of violence with violence. That would be ridiculous. To say that what got us in something will get us out of it. And so we need some intellectual honesty, some spiritual honesty. I think this is the time really for some spiritual leaders with moral fiber and integrity to be a part of what's happening today and to utilize some methods and some language that's not about dehumanizing or denigrating other people, but causes us to live as our higher selves, because I think we're living far below our capacity collectively as human beings, far, far below. But as long as we think we're doing all right and we're living at capacity, we'll keep going. But there are 3 dimensions, Dr. King said, of this complete life. And we have to grab all of those dimensions and work with them so that our spiritual selves, our physical selves, our relationships with God, our relationships with each other, that we're good neighbors, that we have this manifestation of all these ways we can be nonviolent. I think we have to influence youth and get on these spaces and put far more good stuff and language of nonviolence out there to give strategy and practical tools for how to achieve the society that we want to, as Dr. King said, to make of this old world a new world.
Powerful, powerful. So in light of that, you shared so much there, but I want to kind of hone in on the idea of dilemmas and possibilities in our new world. Dr. West, social media has changed how people organize and how causes are amplified. What are some of the ways that we can use social media and digital tools to support nonviolent movements, and what should we be cautious about in this space?
The first thing I was thinking about is that we should be cautious that we don't allow social media to supplement human connection. When Mrs. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, founder of the King Center, was asked, what do you want the internet to be? She said this, and I want us to really hone in on these words that she spoke decades ago. She said she wanted it to be more of a force for nonviolent social change and to serve as a nexus for knitting together global movements. She believed the internet could be a nexus for knitting together global movements to resist injustice, advance human liberation, and build the beloved community. And when we compare that to some of the things we may use it for today, it appears as though we often try to do what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, is destroy ourselves in the misuse of our own instruments. I believe we not only have digital platforms, I would call them digital opportunities, where if we just imagine what we could do with these tools in our hands, instead of hurting each other or criticizing each other or counseling each other, how we could call ourselves into a space where we have that soul force that Mr. Alphin talked about, and we have the spiritual discipline that Mrs. Coretta Scott King talked about, and we call each other up, as Dr. Bernice King often mentioned. I think it's just a matter of getting more of that out there to remind people that we can do that with these digital platforms, that we have before us a digital. I just think about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have done in Montgomery, Alabama with the internet. You know, they're on the campus of Alabama State University making flyers. Joanne Robinson and others, English professor at Alabama State, they're making flyers there if they had other methods. Now, I don't know if that would mean that it would have worked, because sometimes on social media, we put information out about work that we shouldn't put out there. I don't think Dr. King would have done. They didn't tell everything back then. Everything wasn't for public consumption. They had a wisdom in how they were handling things. And I do think there's an opportunity, and it's not just a matter of saying, don't do that way, you're wrong. It's inviting people to work together, because what Mrs. King said in that quote, to me, there's such a spirit of collaboration and humanity there that I think we can capture in social media spaces. And then just personally stopping ourselves from tweeting and posting, Xing, whatever you call it now, Xing, some of the things that we put out there today. Being careful, using nonviolence internally to guard ourselves from putting some things out there that are not helpful, that are not kind, that are not expedient, that aren't strategic in helping us accomplish what we want to accomplish with policies and with other forms of change.
And also, Dr. West, I think that the disinformation on the media, in the 60s, the opposition has learned also. In fact, I always say it, at every level there's a different devil. So they've learned how to counteract this. So we need to make sure, I'd like to discuss with some young generation people, how do you sift through the misinformation? Because there's countries that are doing this misinformation on purpose. And I believe they're trying to start a race route, because everything happens, they want to make it black and white. So that disinformation is dangerous. And once it gets out there, boy, it just goes viral. So I would like to see, in the use of that media, how do you begin to sift that so that people don't go out, I would say, half-cocked or with misinformation or information that are put out there about provocateurs and also countries that hate us and want to destroy us.
But I do think what both of y'all are saying, it still comes back to what we all know, which is we got to figure out how people can understand the importance of studying and immersing themselves. And we will say Kingian nonviolence, because you tell people that, but it's like something has to happen inside for people to do what we're talking about externally, and even galvanizing people, as you're saying, Charles, to a place where we're using it as a powerful vehicle of transferring truth and accuracy, and not feeding into the noise. Because I think a lot of times what happens is people start a fight on social media and we get into it with them, and we have valuable opportunities, as she said, to share a higher level of information and not get into the fist fight with them on social media, so to speak. But again, it's a spiritual discipline that we're calling people in. It's a mental discipline. And, you know, LeBron James is as bad as he is because he's very disciplined in that area. And he practices and he corrects things that he needs to correct. He works on things that he needs to work on. So we got to do that. So we do have part of our presenting this tonight is also, and you'll hear more about it, to invite you into this journey, into this way of life, because we believe that it is the pathway to creating the world that I think we talked about earlier that most people want. Most people want to live in a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. But how do you get there? And nonviolence as a way of life helps us to get there.
I want to add, Pastor, I think it's important to start at the foundation, because we've talked about the nonviolence, but I will offer to you all that I don't wake up in the morning praying that I'm a vessel for nonviolence. I wake up in the morning praying that I'm a vessel for love.
Right.
And love is the foundation for nonviolence. So if you picture it, you have this house, or you can say you have a plant or a tree that has roots, or my grandmothers would say roots. You got roots. You have some roots, you know, that are going to give you in that soil that's growing, you know, what's there. And if love is my foundation or my roots, then nonviolence would be the trunk, you know, and all these other behaviors come out from that. So I wake up in the morning, I think, how can I be a vessel for love? Well, what's my pathway? What are my principles? What are my core values? And those 6 principles of nonviolence give me some of those core values. They provide me that structure and that strength to do that. And what are my actions, my steps? I branch out. So I just want to encourage people to get your roots right. Get your foundation
roots right.
Get your roots right. Wow.
Get your roots right.
The fruit will be all right if you get your roots right, huh?
That's right.
That's right.
If you water the roots and pray to be more loving and more kind and compassionate, this nonviolence, it takes that foundation. You can't try to get to nonviolence missing that foundation.
Yeah.
That agape love. Yeah.
Absolutely. GA says, I continue to land on nonviolence as a discipline of your emotions. It takes information, strategy, and execution. Absolutely. Tracy Weston says from LinkedIn, as an educator, our youth look at history as a story in a book. They appear to be detached from what it took to get us to integration. I encourage all parents and schools to take children to visit historic sites, such as Selma, Montgomery, and Atlanta historic sites instead, or along with visiting a beach or a theme park. Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely. So tonight's discussion was entitled The Transformative Power of Nonviolence, a Path to Lasting Change. And so I don't think we can discuss the idea of lasting change without wrestling with what does a vision forward look like. And so I want to kind of pose this question to our CEO, Dr. King, with regard to a vision forward. If we look toward the future, Dr. King, how do you imagine nonviolence making a difference in the big challenges our world is facing? In other words, if nonviolence were practiced and followed, what kind of new world would we see?
Making this old world a new world. Well, I think it goes back to what Vonnetta just said about the roots, the foundation. You know, I imagine a world where people are love-centered in their leadership, in their parenting, in their educating, in their policy and decision-making, you know, in their way of creating entertainment, movies, games, etc. You know, because when you're love-centered, there's certain things you don't tolerate. There's certain things you do, and there's certain things you don't tolerate. You know, a love-centered person does not tolerate hunger. A love-centered person doesn't come into agreement with things where there's attempts to take over, exploit people and countries and their resources. A love-centered person will come alongside and say, how can we help you develop and utilize those resources and not just take your resources. So for me, it really is about how do we get people grounded in love in this world? So everything that they see, do, comes from that space. I don't see how you can ignore poverty and how you can feel good about people exploiting and oppressing people around the world. I don't know how you sleep with thinking that, you know, there's an imbalance in the distribution of resources in this world. That people, you know, many people, especially in our nation, you know, don't even have health care. They have to choose between, you know, paying rent, paying medicine. I mean, it's something fundamentally wrong in a world like that. And so I think, the vision is where you have people who have aligned with themselves with love, and they take what we're about to hear about, these principles and steps of nonviolence, and they begin to apply it in our world so that we eliminate those triple evils that my father talked about and their offspring: poverty, racism, and militarism. Or as he said, poverty, extreme materialism, racism, and militarism, war. So for me, that's what that new world looks like. It looks like people who don't need DEI and laws and anything. And we need DEI now because our heart's not right. Our heart is not anchored in love. Because when you're anchored in love, you don't need a DEI because you ensure that there's fair and equitable practices in your particular environment. You ensure that there's fair opportunity and access. But that's not where we are. So we got to work on our love quotient in this nation and across the world. Then we can start talking about the content of our character. Because they didn't talk about no colorblind world. I don't know. I have a cousin who said, if you colorblind, then you need glasses. So yeah. But I know we need to get to some. I think there were some questions and the principles and steps.
Yeah. So again, thank you all so much for tonight's discussion. Great exchange. Very, 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 very thoughtful, insightful, and empowering. I do want to pause now, and there are a few questions in the chat we want to make sure that we acknowledge before we move forward. So our first question, again, comes from Tamikia, from YouTube. How far do you think nonviolence can go? Can it win wars? If someone chooses violence towards you, is it okay to use violence as defense or retaliation?
That's a lot of questions there.
Yeah. I'll start off with the first one. Number one, nonviolence is proactive. So therefore, we're looking to prevent war, not to mediate war. So we know in our society, in your community, there's violent-prone situations that are about to pop out in your community. You want to make sure in nonviolence 365, you're proactive. You're looking at violent-prone situations, and you want to eliminate that before it starts. Normally, wars can be eliminated, normally I say, before they start. And that's what we want to look at is how do you prevent it, not to mediate it or try to negotiate it. So we're looking at violence as being preventable. We, in the United States, we know young people in our community who will be dead or in jail in the next 5 years. The question that Dr. King and Mrs. King was asked, what are you doing about that? What's your proactive? Since you know them, the police department knows them, the social agencies know them, and the school system knows them. What are you doing? So therefore, we look at war and violence as being proactive and prevent it before it can expand or get to be a disease.
And then I'll add, because I know, Wes, you want to say something as well. But I would add what my mother said when she was asked the question in her last public interview by Tavis Smiley. Mrs. King, do you believe that nonviolence would work in a world where there's an Osama bin Laden back then, a terrorist, Osama bin Laden? And she said, absolutely, it'll work yesterday, today, and 2,000 years from now. What did she mean by that? She was basically, and she went on to explain it, if you teach nonviolence early on to young people in places across this world, you won't end up with an Osama bin Laden. The problem is we have not yet learned the way of nonviolence. We haven't yet taught this love-centered way. And so if you're talking about a war, it's like he said, we're trying to get to a world where war is not even an option because we are operating holistically around the world, because now we're raising people from a young age, so they have a different mindset than we have right now collectively. And so I toss the next part to you about sprinkling in a little violence or whatever you need to do. The personal versus the, the personal versus the movement. I toss that to you.
Well, I think it's important to understand that nonviolence, Kenyan nonviolence, is about the greatest good. And I when we confuse it with things like domestic violence, we have a principle that people wrestle with, and principle 4. It's not about what people often think it's about, and we'll share more about that in a bit. But I think it's important to understand that Dr. King wasn't ever inviting us to kind of have this sense of acquiescence to injustice. And so if you see somebody in harm's way, even as you see people taken hostage and prisoners and unjustly held and detained and things like that, you have to consider the greatest good. And he encourages us to be strategic in our thinking, love-centered in our thinking. And so often we don't do that. So we don't actually know what nonviolence can do because we haven't applied it. We haven't presented it. And so that's where we come in and encourage that application. When you talk about self-defense, Dr. King understood that, the need to protect yourself. He personally was not a person who would, in his words, harm other people. He just didn't want that blood on his hands. That's a decision for each of us to make. And he made that decision. In fact, when he was stabbed, he asked, how was the woman who stabbed him? I don't know. That's next level to me, y'all. Somebody done stabbed me and almost missed my aorta and I could have died. I don't know if my question's going to be, how's she doing?
No, I could have been asleep.
I can get my hands on her because I'm still practicing and studying. But, you think about that thing and what Mr. Alphin said is true. I think it's easy to start to doubt nonviolence and ask, will it win wars? Well, nobody wins wars.
Right.
That's King. He said wars are poor chisels for carving out peaceful tomorrows. That's an illusion that we have. Now, what can happen is that some people need to be freed from war. And there are people in precarious situations. And we would never want to say Dr. King would be okay with people staying in concentration camps and not being liberated, things of that nature. Then we have to ask ourselves, how did we get to that place where a hateful ideology permeated enough people that they thought it was okay to kill not only 6 million of our Jewish neighbors, but millions of other neighbors from other ethnicities and disabled neighbors with disabilities. So as long as we don't ask the question, how did we get here, we'll stay stuck where we are, because in that question, that's our answers to how we use nonviolence to get out.
And that's the question we need to be asking right now.
How do we get here?
How do we get here?
That's right.
Right. And our next question for tonight, for the panel, is from Tara Madison. Could the principles of nonviolence be a tool for addressing our youth in Chicago and the dangerous behaviors with teen gatherings that are antisocial and violent?
Well, from a law enforcement perspective, when I first learned this through the King Center, I went back to my community, and I had a community filled with 9-year-old kids selling drugs and crack cocaine and killing in St. Louis, Missouri. And I used this whole approach to begin to see what was the cause. See, Dr. King and Gandhi never worked on symptoms. Black on black crime was symptoms of much bigger causes. Drugs in the community are symptoms. People acting out of character are symptoms. So you have to see what's driving their behavior. So I had to go in, talk about the King Center, and begin to peel the onion back to see what's the core was driving that behavior. And what I found in that community is that the living conditions were unbearable. There was no jobs. There were people coming out of jail that didn't have education. There were violations of racism, police brutality, and that was a cycle of violence. And I had to break that cycle of violence. Otherwise, it would have kept going. It wasn't the person that was doing it. It was the actions that they were forced to do because of the conditions they were living in. And so we have to be careful when we go into communities that we have enough time to dig and look to see the history of what has happened, and in our country understand how these communities were redlined and gerrymandered, and freeways went through most of the urban settings to produce these ghettos, as we call them. So you have to go back at least 40, 50 years to understand the history, where it came from, and why people are acting out of character.
And Damien, I want to suggest as a good segue that we move into the principles and steps, considering the time that we can present those now.
Absolutely. All right. Well, first, let me pause here. I want to thank each of you for making time to share with our viewers on tonight. Again, our discussion on the transformative power and nonviolence, a path to lasting change. Thank you all so much. Mr. Alphin, thank you so much for your time. Dr. West and Dr. King, we thank you so much for your intellect, your insight, your brilliance, and how you unpack nonviolence in such a powerful way. And so for our viewers who are watching on tonight, what we want to do is we want to move from the idea, from discussion, from the idea, but also provide you with what are those steps and principles that you've been hearing about all night long. And so for a few moments, we're going to share, again, a mini session, mini exposure to the steps and principles of nonviolence, presented by Dr. Vonnetta L. West, who is our learning experience curator and nonviolence educator here at the King Center. And so again, so book your seats, have a seat, relax for a few moments, and as we share more about what are the underpinnings of nonviolence via the steps and principles that you heard about tonight. So Dr. West, the floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Damien. I'm going to ask that we pull up a slide. Just start with our slides there and move quickly to the next one. Thank you so much. Just want to share here and be sure that we give you these principles and steps. This is a quote that Dr. Bernice King shared earlier in our broadcast. I just want you to see it. It's from Dr. King's Noble Lecture, December 11, 1964. Not his acceptance speech, his Noble Lecture, which was a much longer speech called The Quest for Peace and Justice. Just holding it up for you there for a moment as we go now to the next slide. Just want to ask you the question, what have you discovered about Dr. King's teachings that's tangible and teachable today? Just to pause for a moment, reflect for a moment, just based on what Mr. Alphin and Dr. Bernice King and I have shared in this learning experience today. What have you discovered that you might not have known before? I want you to share that, post that, use the hashtag the King Center, and also transformative nonviolence, hashtag transformative nonviolence, hashtag the King Center, hashtag transformative nonviolence. Next slide. Keep these helpful phrases in mind as we go through the principles and steps. Strategies for change. These principles and steps help provide us with strategies for change. Shifting culture. Principles for community service. Keys for character development. These principles and steps help us develop character. They can help us meet critical needs, but they can also help us change systems and edifices that cause these critical needs. So we need to know how to do community service and how to serve people. That's what many folks have turned Dr. King into only, but we forget he understood too, we need to dismantle and eradicate culture, change culture, shift culture, also dismantle and eradicate some systemic issues and those large evils that Dr. Bernice King was talking about earlier. Next slide. Just want to get us quickly to our principles now. This is our definition for nonviolence. It's two of my favorite photos of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we don't want to forget that, and Mrs. Coretta Scott King. And we've shared this definition earlier in our broadcast. The next slide should be our principles of nonviolence. 6 principles. Want to note for you that Dr. King first shared these 6 principles in writing in his book, Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story. I want to encourage you to buy that book to read, to learn about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from him. Because in that book, Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story, you'll find the 6th chapter, Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, where he shares more details about these principles. You also can find them at thekingcenter.org with a bit more details. I encourage you to keep studying with us and study our online course at thekingcenterinstitute.org. I want to start at the bottom with the sixth principle. Nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. This principle can be used as an umbrella for the other principles. I'll tell you why as I go through them and just encourage you to keep studying. If I believe that the universe is on the side of justice and I have a cosmic companion, for those of us who believe that's God, we have God, who is a God of justice, as Dr. Bernice King mentioned earlier. But we understand that the forces within the world are on the side of justice. Then we know we have to be on the side of justice too. Note now, this doesn't say nonviolence believes that people are on the side of justice. People have to get there because we're living so far away from our divine intent and the divinity that's in us, the people who we could be, that we have to get back to who we were created and put here to be. And for those who don't believe in creation, I just say to you, we have to get back to the reason why we're here. And the reason why we're here certainly isn't to destroy each other. Even the universe is on the side of justice. Now, whatever you think justice is, if it's not this, I want you to replace it with this. Dr. King said justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. So here when you say this principle, say nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of love, agape love, unconditional love, correcting everything that stands against love. Just by this principle alone, we know that nonviolence is not passive, because nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of love, correcting everything that stands against love. In another speech, Dr. King said that justice at its best is power, correcting everything that stands against love. And sometimes I just say love, power, correcting everything that stands against love. So if I believe that, then I can get with principle one. And I can say nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Check this out. It's not a courageous way of life. Sometimes we flip that thing and we're just like, nonviolence is a courageous way of life. No, it's a way of life for courageous people. One of the things I believe about Dr. King is that he was very intentional with his language. And I believe what he's saying here is you first have to choose courage before you can choose nonviolence. That you first have to say, I may have some trepidation and I may have some concerns, but something has to change. And so I'm choosing to be a courageous person. And that's going to allow me to choose nonviolence as a way of life. If I believe that I'm on the side of a universe, God, who is on the side of justice, I have to be courageous. I have to choose this way of life. Then nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Now, I know somebody out there is saying right now, I'm just not going to be running after people who discriminating against me or treating me wrong, who I'm in conflict with, to win friendship and understanding. This means that I'm not trying to humiliate people. I'm not trying to get rid of people. I want to always have my soul in the position for reconciliation. I want my heart to be ready for love and kindness. That means that I'm not injuring myself by hating people and by perpetually misunderstanding folks. This is about my condition. So if I'm embracing nonviolence and I'm on the side of justice, love correcting everything that stands against love, I want to win some friendship and understanding. I don't want people to stay where they are. I don't want them to remain where they are in their thinking. I want them to have in my presence an opportunity for consciousness, for love, and for kindness. And if I get this sixth principle, and I'm with this universe, God is on the side of justice, I'm going to try to defeat the injustice, not the people. Why? Because as Dr. King said in the World House chapter of his last book, where do we go from here, chaos or community? He said, we have to learn to live together. And essentially, he said, if we don't learn to live together, then we'll perish together. We'll get rid of each other. So I can't be out here trying to get rid of people. Sometimes our language reflects, as we're facing these trials and these different things happening in society, that we prefer to get rid of people than do the much more complex work of defeating injustice as we're on the side of justice. But I'm going to bend with the universe. You've heard that quote. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And then this principle 6 helps me get with principle 4. Nonviolence holds that voluntary, unearned, think about that word, voluntary, think about the word unearned suffering for a just cause, not just because, is redemptive and can educate and transform. Sometimes people lift up our dear brother Emmett Till as an example of this, but Emmett Till's suffering wasn't voluntary. So we have to get rid of that. Now I want you to think about Mamie Till Mobley, who, when she had a decision to make about whether or not she would close the casket at her son Emmett's funeral, she decided to keep that casket open because she believed it could educate and transform. That's an example of this principle. That was voluntary. She could have kept it closed. It was painful for her. And then for us, in our everyday lives, we have an opportunity to decide whether or not we retaliate when someone harms us, whether or not we retaliate by hating other people, whether or not we choose, with our goal as the beloved community and a shift in society as our goal, to give something up. So if we get in this word suffering and we just like, oh, I don't want to suffer, and we don't think about this word sacrifice that we have before us, who came before us, people who said, I'm going to give this up to get to something different for generations to come. That's our choice today. Principle 4, am I a courageous person? Do I want to win friendship and understanding? Do I want to defeat injustice instead of people? Do I want to think about how to dismantle evil instead of humiliating people, the people who may be vessels for that evil? Then I want to ask myself this: if I think about a cause today that's important to me, what am I willing to give to change that social ill, to transform society? That's principle 4. Then I have another choice. I've chosen courage. I've chosen nonviolence as a way of life. As I said before about the roots and the foundation, I got to choose love. And love is a weak thing that we often think it is. That's why the King Center has a Be Love movement. Love is this thing that causes us to shift and transform from the inside out. And it says to us, I refuse to live in a society where people are mistreated and harmed. What can I do? But it's also self-love. Is that I not only refuse to hate other people, that I have to have some healthy perceptions and concepts about myself. Those are the 6 principles. Keep studying them. Don't leave them. Go to the website. Learn more at thekingcenter.org. The next slide. And I'll share these 6 steps quickly. We talked about information gathering here. That's always going to start us out. But these steps aren't always in this order. They're not like literal stair steps. But we always need good information, and we need the right information, which means we need unbiased information. So if you have one source that you always go to for information on a conflict or an issue or a cause, switch it up. Find some more sources. Use the internet for good. Find some people. Don't discount still talking to people to find out what happened. Then we have to educate. We have to educate not just our inner circle, but we have to have some education campaigns. You think about how we could use the internet today to educate on the truth of what happened in particular issues, just truth historically. Then as Mr. Alphin mentioned soul force, and we talked about spiritual discipline, we have to have personal commitment. Did you know that when folks were involved in nonviolent campaigns, particularly in Birmingham, if they wanted to protest, but they couldn't do it without responding violently when people violated them, they had to be given something else to do as a part of the campaign, because nonviolence is supposed to dramatize the issue. And you can't dramatize the issue when you become a part of the issue by responding violently. So you had to have commitment. You have to develop that commitment through prayer, meditation, conversation that strengthens your soul and your courage, reading. All of those things matter. Negotiation. Now you have to have someone with the capacity to go in and negotiate, because the goal of negotiation is to create what we call a win-win, where you don't have a loser, you have a path forward to get to this 6th step, which is reconciliation. Well, sometimes negotiation, where you've learned information, you're educated, you have commitment, it breaks down. And when it breaks down, you get to direct action. And there are many forms of direct action. And that's where Dr. King said, for the purpose of direct action is to make it clear who's the oppressed and who's the oppressor. You should never look at a direct action campaign and not be sure, who's being harmed. It should be clear by the strategy. And the strategy should be, we're going to meet, as Mr. Alphin pointed out, physical force with soul force. And when confronted with hate, we're going to meet with love, because that's strategic. But it's also the right thing to do in nonviolence. All of this is purpose to get us to reconciliation. And just 3 things I want to say quickly about reconciliation, that it's not just, can we all just get along? It is, can we reach agreement on how we go forward? Second thing I want to point out is that reconciliation includes repair. So reparations is not a dirty word. When there's been psychological harm, there needs to be psychological repair. When there's been physical harm, there needs to be physical repair. When there's been economic harm, there needs to be economic repair. When there's been generational harm, there needs to be generational repair. Educational harm, we need educational repair. Reparations is a part of reconciliation. We cannot in good faith and authentically say we want to reconcile if we don't include reparations. Third thing, reconciliation includes justice. It includes that correction of those things that stand against love. It is not, let me find more Black friends, let me find more LGBTQ friends, and that will validate to people and to myself that I'm not a bigot, that I'm not racist, that I'm not homophobic. No. Reconciliation means we agree that we will treat each other differently going forward. Reconciliation is a part of the beloved community. We believe at the King Center we can create it. That's our vision. The beloved community where injustice ceases and love prevails. And we believe that with Kenyan nonviolence, with these 6 principles and these 6 steps, understanding that we can bend with the moral arc of the universe, and we can undergird those steps, these steps with those 6 principles, or it's not Kenyan nonviolence, we can reach the beloved community, which Mrs. King said is an achievable society. It's achievable. It's a realistic vision of an achievable society. We can get there. We want to invite you to keep studying, keep learning with us, keep strategizing with us, and to use Kenyan nonviolence to organize in a way that you don't seek to dehumanize or denigrate other people, but you seek to defeat the injustice that they may be vessels for. These are just questions for you. As you think about these principles and steps, we'll just leave this up for a few moments as we close out this session on this evening. I'm going to invite Damien and Angelo to come on now.
Dr. West, thank you so much for that mini session on nonviolence.
It was many too, Damien. We made it through, though.
Made it through.
Got some key points out.
Well, again, we invite you all to take part of the much more broad experience. I'm going to toss now to Angelo, who is with Better Together at the King Center, and we will shift from there. Ms. Angelo?
Yes, the King Center wants to thank you all for joining us tonight as we learned about the transformative power of nonviolence. If you haven't filled out our survey yet, please take some time to do so through our QR code that is on the screen. You can also find more information about the King Center's Better Together initiative on our website, thekingcenter.org. Again, thank you for joining us tonight for this powerful and much needed transformative shared experience. Thank you.
Nonviolence is the answer to the crucial political and moral questions of our time. The need for man to overcome oppression and violence without resorting to violence and oppression. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation. The foundation of such a method is love.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. changed the world when he demonstrated what could be achieved through nonviolence. Now, you can learn how to live and practice this philosophy yourself through Nonviolence 365 Online, an innovative digital experience developed by the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Nonviolence 365 Online features extensive video interviews with real nonviolence practitioners, including the King Center CEO Dr. Bernice A. King, King Center certified instructors and trainers, and veterans of the civil rights movement. Explorations of the historic campaigns that helped Dr. King forge his philosophy. Immersive, annotated reading experiences that enhance Dr. King's most influential writings on nonviolence. Custom activities, including quizzes and interactive scenarios to help you practice along the way. Real-world exercises to help you start applying nonviolence in your daily life. Nonviolence 365 is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, engaging, and acting that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. It isn't just a concept for philosophers or political leaders. Nonviolence 365 is a powerful, practical approach to dealing with conflict and dismantling injustice. Whether it's in your personal life, in your school or workplace, your local community, or a national movement. Dr. King, Mrs. Coretta Scott King, and many others sought to create the beloved community, a society built on global cooperation and equity. This wasn't a lofty utopian dream. It's a realistic and achievable goal because each and every one of us has the power to make it happen by committing to nonviolence as a way of life. Take the first step today with Nonviolence 365 Online.
The King Center, founded by Coretta Scott King, is the official institution of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, championing and developing nonviolent leaders. In 2024, we impacted over 100,000 youth, equipped 150 interns, and trained over 2,000 leaders in nonviolent strategies. Join King 100 as we build King Center 2.0, empower 500,000 youth, and train 1 million individuals on Nonviolence 365. Join the movement at thekingcenter.org. Text MLKGIVE to 44321.